Greetings, comrades. Let's start with a quick review of what you know and what you're a bit hazy on leading into the exam. So pause the video on this slide, review each of these dot points, ask yourself if you've got a good grasp of these concepts, ask yourself if you can apply these to given scenarios, and if you're giving yourself a thumbs up on all of these points, then you are well placed to tackle this AOS in the upcoming exam. Behaviorism is a school of psychology that has the key premise that behavior is learned as a result of environmental encounters. And when we look at classical conditioning, learning through the repeated association of two or more stimuli, we need to demonstrate that we have a clear understanding of how this differs from operant conditioning. So the key feature of classical conditioning is that a response to stimuli will be involuntary or reflexive, triggered by some type of autonomic nervous system activity, whether it be salivating, flinching, some type of fear response that triggers the sympathetic NS. Now, when you get a question that asks you to explain this three-phase model or use the terms of classical conditioning, there's a few key points of emphasis here. Just remember, before conditioning, the UCS and the NS are separate. And then during the conditioning process, we repeatedly pair them. The order is important. The NS is first, closely followed by the UCS. And then after the conditioning phase, the NS is now a CS, which on its own triggers the CR. Now, in this scenario here, a trainer has used a shock collar to classically condition dogs to avoid snakes. And so part A of the question is asking the student to use the terms of classical conditioning to describe what's creating the association between the NS and the UCS. So check out the stats on this. Students struggled with this. There are a lot of ones, a lot of twos, few zeros, not many threes. So in terms of the marking guide, 1 mark for simply identifying what the NS and the UCS was. That's specified in the question in terms of the NS and the UCS. So that's a command. These are command terms. So the NS was the side of a snake and the UCS was getting zapped from the collar. 1 mark for that combination. Second mark was what a lot of students missed out on because of a lack of detail. So typically students emphasize there needs to be repetition. Typically students stated that the repetition involves the pairing of the NS and the UCS, but what students lost marks on was the failure to discuss the order. So therefore, emphasis needs to be placed on the rules of classical conditioning, that the trainer should present the NS first, and then immediately after that, the UCS. So the dog sees the snake, and then straight after that they get zapped, so that that association has been created. Third mark is for describing the success of the conditioning, that after that repetition, the dog sees the snake on its own, no shock required, and that will trigger some type of fear or avoidance response. Then we get to operant conditioning, also from the behaviorist school of psychology, that again argues that behavior is learned through environmental encounters. But this time, it's a conscious process where the learning is determined by the consequences that follow a response. So when asked to use the three-phase model, students find it a little bit tricky in terms of identifying antecedents. So if you are having difficulty with that, focus on the behavior. So the behavior might be slowing down when you're driving, studying hard for an exam. What triggered that? The antecedent might be being told or having an exam scheduled. Driving slower, the antecedent might be a 40-kilometre sign, etc. So again, the antecedent needs to be some type of stimulus or event that causes a conscious change in behavior. And then following that behavior, there needs to be a consequence applied. There could be a punisher or a reinforcer. Now, when you're asked what type of consequence is it, then you need to follow the three-pronged approach that I've got on the right here. First of all, ask yourself this: is the intention of the consequence to increase the target behavior or decrease it? So as I've got on this flowchart here, if we're trying to increase the behavior, then it's a type of reinforcement. And if we're trying to reduce it, then it's a type of punishment. And then the second question is, are we adding or removing a stimulus? And that will determine whether it's pos or neg, punishment or reinforcement. So therefore, both of these points need to be dealt with, that the behavior will be strengthened as a result of the consequence, and we're adding a stimulus in the case of reinforcement, something desirable like money or likes. If it's punishment, something undesirable like a smack. Or are we removing something in the case of neg reinforcement, the removal of a headache, the removal of getting the flu, the removal of tight muscles, negative. Or punishment, we're removing money, something desirable, etc. So again, emphasis on those 3 points that I've got listed on the right here. To illustrate, let's have a look at this 2016 question. So Tim was fined for jaywalking when the pedestrian signal was red, and the question's asking, using the 3-phase model, explain how he's learned not to cross the light when the pedestrian light is red. So we've clearly got to identify what the antecedent is. The antecedent is the red light, because that gives Timmy a choice. His behavior was he ignored what the red light meant. He crossed the intersection, and then he copped a fine as his consequence. Make sure you emphasize the antecedent, response, and consequence. It's 4 marks. So the 4th mark was for emphasizing the fact that this is a type of neg punishment. The fine, we've removed some cash. And why do we do that? To try and decrease his future jaywalking behavior. Then we get to observational learning, socio-cultural approach to learning. Why do we classify it as that? Well, it occurs in a social context, but it's quite a cognitive process, because if you think about attention and retention, the first 2 stages, there's a lot of cognition going on there in terms of actively watching the model's behavior, creating that mental representation. More cognition than operant, and certainly classical. So in terms of the 5 stages, you might be asked to identify the first couple, the last couple. Maybe you're asked to identify which stage is relevant from the scenario. Here's a few tips when I go through this next question. So this question is really retro from the exam in which some of you guys were born, but we've got a 5 marker here. Jodie wants her daughter to learn how to cook. Describe how she could do that via observational learning. Check out the stats. Students struggled on this, even though it's a fairly simple task, you'd think. But the reason why students lost marks on this is simply for a failure to clearly link each stage to the scenario. So in terms of attention, just saying that she watched doesn't cut it. What we need to mention is that basically the daughter is actively observing mum's actions and observing distinctive features. So we've got to go a bit beyond just saying watch. Then a lot of students just simply said she remembers it, or she makes a mental representation. That's not linking it to the scenario. So make sure you say she's creating a mental representation of some of the cooking actions. Now, the reproduction is not the daughter actually reproducing the behavior and cooking herself. It's observational learning, not observational doing. The daughter's got to have the physical and mental ability to do it. Again, it's observational learning. In terms of the motivation, the daughter must be motivated to try and replicate this behavior in the future when she gets her opportunity. And then the reinforcer is applied to the model, to mum, not to the daughter when she actually cooks later on. Mum gets the reinforcer when she has success in the kitchen and she makes something, and then she gives herself a eureka moment, a pat on the back, etc. And just to further illustrate this, check out this question from a couple of years back. So we've got Justine learning a editing technique for filmmaking, and we've basically been asked which stage of observational learning applies to this editing process. So students were split on this, A, B, and again, we've got double figure percentages for all 4 options. So this is a good question in terms of really stretching students' understanding of the detail of observational learning. So A is the correct response, even though it wasn't the most popular one. And the problem with B is it's asking the model to put into place the skills. And again, it's observational learning, not observational doing. So therefore, we can eliminate B, and it shows that students have a misunderstanding of this, where if we look at A, committing the processes to memory. Now, I know that's gone at fairly a simple explanation of stage 2, but a process of elimination will get you there. So again, the problem with C is it's the model who gets the recognition, not the learner. And the problem with D is we don't have to write down. There's a number of options in terms of that attention mechanism. Now, you don't need to know all 8 ways of knowing if you get a question on this. Your point of emphasis should be on the fact that when we talk about the learning processes of First Nations people, that they don't just follow a linear Western approach. Their learning is based on a holistic process made up of these interwoven elements that are linked to their relationship to country. If you're asked a question on this with a scenario, I would pick one of these out. Storytelling is probably one of the easiest ones because you can emphasize a yarn. Possibly you could reference a learning map, which is not like on an atlas, but simply explaining the process of how you learn things sequentially. But what I've got there in that purple color, those are the points of emphasis, that it's a holistic approach. It's made up of these interwoven 8 elements that are linked to kinship to country. Now, there are 3 facets of the course that are referred to in terms of the explanatory power of a particular model. So we have the transactional model and the GAS in Unit 3 AOS 1, and we have the multi-store model. Now, what we mean by the explanatory power of the model is you need to be able to highlight the strengths and weaknesses of this model in terms of explaining the process of memory, particularly in terms of encoding, storage, and retrieval. Multi-store, think about what that means. We've got these 3 distinct stores that vary in terms of certain characteristics. So make sure you can distinguish these stores in terms of capacity, duration. The function of sensory memory, well, that's the entry point. And it holds on to that raw sound or visual information just long enough for us to work out what we're going to attend to, and everything else will rapidly fade, which is a good thing, so we don't get brain overload. What we do attend to will be processed actively in STM, and much of that will be displaced, but if we can somehow link it to existing material in LTM, we'll start that LTP process. And then, if we can adequately encode that new material, it will be retained in LTM, in a neural network. And then when we need to retrieve that information, we need to activate the right queue in order to basically trigger that partial memory trace that will enable us to put it back in STM for use. Now, in terms of your understanding of the types of LTM, be mindful that explicit memories require conscious and intentional recall, and implicit do not. And that's how we differentiate these 2 major categories of memory. So the 3 structures that are relevant in terms of explicit memories, the hippocampus, amygdala, and then neocortex. I'm going to start with the bottom here. The neocortex is where explicit memories are stored, organized, and the neocortex plays a critical role when we're reconstructing a memory by combining the episodic and semantic elements. The hippocampus, that's involved in both the encoding and retrieval of explicit memories. and it basically directs the amygdala to encode and retrieve the emotionality of something. So these three structures do not work in isolation, but in terms of points of difference, the neocortex is largely a storage facility. The hippocampus and amygdala are largely involved in encoding and retrieval. The hippocampus is largely responsible for the semantic aspects of it, contextual elements, and the amygdala for the emotionality of an episodic event. Now, both the basal ganglia and the cerebellum are involved in implicit memory, specifically procedural, but there are some subtle differences. The basal ganglia is involved in habitual behavior, habitual movements. And what it does is it refines these movements through a feedback loop. So for instance, as I've got here with this netball scenario, if a netball player literally tinkers with their follow through, their grip, etc., and you can apply this to any sport, and they're having success, so they've got a higher percentage of goals, or the ball just comes out of the hand and it just feels like it's got a better flow, a better backspin or something like that. The basal ganglia picks up on this and it reinforces those movements. And so therefore what happens is through repetition and practice, the basal ganglia will refine these movements, because again, implicit means that we're not actually consciously focusing on the mechanics of our shooting style, etc., but it will just become habit. So emphasis with the basal ganglia is habit, feedback loop, procedural memory, using the example of somebody in terms of the way they hold their pen, sporting skills, even musicians, the way you work your magic on a keyboard or your string instrument. Now, your cerebellum, also involved in procedural memory, also involved in implicit memory, it's responsible for the encoding and the retrieval of the steps required when we're performing a sequence of movements, e.g. a triple jumper. So memorizing, if you take off for your hop on the right foot, you land on your right foot, you switch to your left foot on your step, and then we land on both feet for the jump. So it's your cerebellum that enables you to encode that. Now the basal ganglia, that's involved in that habit and feedback loop in terms of refining subtle little adjustments to our to the way we plant our foot, etc. But the cerebellum plays a key role in your posture when you're on the move and also when you're still, and it's more involved in gross movements as opposed to the fine motor movements that the basal ganglia is involved in. Check out this question from a couple of years ago. This really stumped students. So Mario, he's won a poetry competition, and the question's asking which brain structure is responsible for the memory of the call, which is largely semantic, and the memory of the feeling, which is largely episodic. Now, what students have missed here is where is it permanently stored? If the question had asked about which of these brain structures would be responsible for the consolidation or retrieval of it, then we get B as your answer, but stored makes it a different question. So memories are stored in the neocortex, so that's a change in study design terminology. Both the semantics and the episodic aspects of it. It's the hippocampus and the amygdala that's involved in the encoding and retrieval. So basically the transfer from STM to LTM in the cortex, and then the retrieval back from the neocortex into STM. Now, in terms of autobiographical memory, before we get into either aphantasia or Alzheimer's, let's just be clear on what we mean by this. So it's a combo of episodic memory, and again, these are explicit. So these are sensory details relating to the emotionality and the time and place that is basically personal to the person forming the memory. The semantic, well, they're facts that we can share, that we can explain in terms of Again, they're autobiographical, but they relate to the memory. So therefore, names, dates, etc. Now, when we're creating an imagined future, we use a combination of episodic and semantic. So the episodic elements, the people, the objects, the places, etc., that help us construct this imagined future. And the semantic network gives us the framework in which we can do this. So in my example here, if you were the lead for a play and you were trying to construct an imagined future of opening night, just to kind of help with your preparation, then the episodic elements are your mates who are the cast members, the props, etc. These relate to a time and a place when these will be needed. And then the actual lines that you're going to use, particularly in your opening monologue, they're semantics, they're factual, which give you a framework for basically visualizing that opening performance. Now, with aphantasia, derived from the Greek without imagination, the emphasis on this is the inability to use visual imagery. And then we need to explain how that's going to impact autobiographical memory. So therefore, if we ask them to visualize, say, their Year 12 psychology teacher, can't do it. And so therefore, that's going to impact their ability to basically retrieve an autobiographical memory because of the difficulty with visualizing both the semantic features of that, but also the episodic aspects of it relating to a time and a place. And they're also going to have the same issue with creating an imagined future, which requires you to tap in to your memory and to use some visualization of semantic details, but also episodic elements that relate to time and place, people, props, etc. So they're going to have problems with either. But their semantic memory is okay, because if you ask them when's their birthday, what's their name, etc., they're going to be able to store and retrieve that information. They're just not going to be able to visualize it, which will impact their ability to construct an imagined future and retrieve an autobiographical memory. Now, the points of emphasis with Alzheimer's disease starts with the fact that we have the degeneration of cells that cause atrophy and lesions in brain tissue. These parts of the brain play a key role in explicit memory, particularly episodic and semantic, which will make it very difficult to retrieve autobiographical memories, particularly as Alzheimer's disease spreads. It starts in the hippocampus, which plays a key role, as we talked about, in terms of the encoding and retrieval of explicit memory. And then later on, it spreads to the neocortex, where memories are stored and reconstructed when we need them. So therefore, that's going to impair memory further. It's incurable. And the early indicators of this are memory loss, particularly with episodic and semantic. Now, if you're asked to compare and contrast Alzheimer's versus aphantasia, there's a few similarities we can go to, but neither have a cure, neither have some definitive intel that explains the underlying causes. Sufferers of both are going to have difficulty retrieving autobiographical memory and indulging in episodic thinking. In terms of points of difference, Alzheimer's, generally there's about a 10-year lifespan from the early diagnosis, whereas aphantasia, they can have decades, 50, 60, 80 years living with their condition because it's not neurodegenerative. Alzheimer's disease is isolated in the hippocampus, whereas the aphantasia is more to do with the occipital lobe. Not that we need to go into detail about the lobes, given that's not part of the Unit 3-4 course. A couple of other points of difference that we can look at here. Now, with the 3 mnemonics that feature in the written cultures in our study design, point of emphasis with all 3 is that they enhance the encoding because they link it to existing material in LTM, and they also provide additional cues that enhances the retrieval when required. So acronyms form a pronounceable word using the first letters, as opposed to acrostics, where we take the first letters of a series of words, we form a phrase that's memorable, and that enhances the organization of material in LTM. In other words, it enhances the encoding. So again, I mentioned that on the previous slide. So therefore, when we need to retrieve the information from those series of words, the first letter acts as a cue that assists that retrieval process. So if we want to memorize the order of the planets, we basically take the first letter of each one of them, and then we form a daggy phrase. My very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas if we want to ignore the fact that Pluto is no longer a planet. Then we basically go through that phrase, and that first letter then acts as a cue to help us memorize the planets. Now, limitation with this, as we can see here, is we might get Mars and Mercury confused. So therefore, it does have a limitation when we have words starting with the same first letter. Now, with the Loki method, again, emphasis on the encoding process, that we need to have a journey with a series of landmarks that we can visualize sequentially. Then we get our list of items, and we mentally associate and visualize each of those items individually at one of our landmarks. So therefore, again, the limitation with this is it takes a lot of work in terms of the encoding process, but the payoff is retrieval. Because if we've done a good job with that visual association with each of our items at each of our landmarks, then when we're going on a mental journey, the retrieval of it is going to be very powerful, because that mental imagery of that location will give us a very powerful cue to help us recall that item. Now, in terms of songlines, think about the context of this. First Nation peoples didn't have written maps, they're an oral culture, so therefore they needed to develop a means of conveying a route, a navigation route for some type of long journey. So the thing with songlines is we use the lyrics, the song narrative, we connect them to the landscape so that we can remember a route. And it uses a multimodal approach. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means we use a combination of the story, song, dance, and therefore by combining these in a multimodal approach, this enhances the encoding process, because we're associating each landmark with some rhythm, with some dance, and therefore that deepens the encoding because we have existing memories of these skills. Then when we're retrieving it, the song, the music, the dancing will help enhance the retrieval of these. They'll act as powerful cues so that we can remember landmark 1, landmark 2, landmark 3 when we're going on this long journey that we're trying to remember and pass on to next generation, etc.